Alright, so I figured right about now would be a good time to talk about these two college-themed movies, right around the time we talked about the, 80s teen comedies with Risky Business and Losing It, and then before that we talked about Porky's and Superbad, getting it from a couple of different decades. And here, while these also come from different decades, they're also they have this very similar vibe and similar comedic aspects to them, and the way they explore the ridiculousness of the characters that inhabit these kind of movies. But that one was also a really, really big comedy at the time, and the other was one that may or may not have been. I really don't know. When I discovered PCU, it was pretty much at random at Blockbuster. Just because it may have been, I would have already known who Jeremy Piven was by then, by Very Bad Things at least, and David Spade, who are both on the cover. So that was probably what mainly drew me to it, and I was probably just looking for a comedy. Um, and I remember when Old School came out vividly, because everybody, like, in my circle had seen it, except for me. And I'm not sure what exactly took me so long, but it was right around the time it came out on DVD that is when I eventually saw it, after everybody else had already talked about it and talked about most of the scenes in it. I think mainly because I just really wasn't, even as an early teenager. I would have been right at the start of teenagerhood when this came out in 2003. I just kind of wasn't into the Will Ferrell thing. Like, I kind of just didn't get it, what the big deal was, and like everybody in my circles were saying, like, Old School is amazing. They were actually using the word amazing, and and for a comedy of this sort, it's kind of hard to know what to expect out of that. Um, Especially when you go in potentially under the assumption that you won't get a lot of the jokes because you're too young. But I learned pretty quickly that Old School isn't really the kind of movie that has that sort of. It's not particularly smart humor most of the time. So even at 13, I didn't feel like it was over my head or anything. Not to sound condescending to it or anything, but just, yeah, the jokes are pretty right there. And PCU is pretty much the same way, just under the it's still under the PG-13, so it's not quite gone for the raunch as much as Old School is. But obviously, one of the main connecting factors here would be that, and I still have no idea if it's ever been confirmed if this was intentional or not. The whole idea that the main connection between these two movies is Jeremy Piven, and the fact that PCU happened, and then in Old School, he's basically playing the character that he completely stood against in PCU. Like, it's just one big in joke, basically. So no idea if there's real confirmation on that, or if it's just happened to turn out that way. But yeah, I figured we would go into these. Worth noting, the only way I own PCU is with this, so you just kind of have to ignore Airheads being here. I'm surely we'll talk about Airheads at some point in the near future. But in the meantime, yeah, we will get to these two. And I guess the first thing to notice is that they both have notable directors. Uh, Obviously, Old School is by future multiple Oscar nominee Todd Phillips, which is still a little weird to say. Pretty much right off of, or 3 years off of Road Trip, which was kind of his big breakout as far as being a comedic director. And the director of PCU seems to be a director for hire job, because the director of PCU is Hart Bachner. And if you don't know him by name, that, I shit you not, is Ellis from Die Hard. So, you can see where we're coming from. The guy that made Road Trip made a college movie, and Ellis from Die Hard made a college movie. So, we'll see how these shape up together. But we might as well start with Old School. We'll probably bounce around a lot, though. Because, like I was saying, obviously Old School is definitely the more familiar movie to a lot of people. I'm pretty sure PCU does have its fan base. You just gotta look for them, but they're out there. And you can throw them a quote or two, and you'll get a quote in return. And it's one of those where you feel like you're almost in some sort of club or something, and it's really nice when you say a PCU quote and then somebody throws it back to you. And pretty much everybody could probably do that with Old School. So and you've certainly got your pick of the litter of its choice of lines. But the thing here about it being like, if you want to talk about the characters and how these movies aren't necessarily like the kind of movies you go into looking for like really big character depth. Obviously, you're mainly looking for the humor and the jokes and stuff like that. But there are a lot of movies like this that kind of find that other area and kind of go in that direction of having something to the characters enough that gets you invested enough that it might make situations even funnier to see those characters in them. And as far as old school goes, it's obviously, if that's going to happen, it's going to be with one of the main three or a couple of the main three at least. Where you have Luke Wilson being our straight man, and then you've got Will Ferrell doing super over the top Will Ferrell, and Vince Vaughn doing his, swingers, wedding crashers, way of delivery, that kind of character. Even though this is 2 years pre Wedding Crashers, it's definitely post swingers. So we're getting that Vince Vaughn territory that really has never really gone away, even since. So um, if you want to talk about any sort of arching thing here with characters, I guess you can look at, as far as me saying I wasn't a fan of the Will Ferrell thing at the time, and it still he has to do it at just the right way for it to be as funny. Like, if he's doing a Ricky Bobby or a Ron Burgundy, then I'm on board. And the thing about Frank does seem to be that it's the character that, like, if you don't like the Will Ferrell thing, it's kind of the point that the character's doing the Will Ferrell thing when he should be moving on from it, which makes it even weirder that this was so early in his big movie career anyway. Because obviously he had a lot of SNL before this, but even so, it is interesting how they kind of start off with misdirection with Frank, where it starts off with his wedding, and he's the one that's getting married, and Beanie's there talking about how this is a really big mistake. Even though he's married, it's a really big mistake, and you're only going to have one vagina for the rest of your life. He makes that Columbus comment that's quite funny. Um, and like I said, we've got Luke Wilson, who's kind of at a dead end here after Juliette Lewis cheats on him and he walks in on her threesome. It seems like Will Ferrell's going to be the one that's the mature character of the group, because Luke Wilson obviously is sort of descending. It's like he's kind of letting everything go after this Juliette Lewis thing. Um, and that's kind of a funny concept in itself, to go into a movie like this and Will Ferrell being the responsible one, or setting it up that he's going to be the responsible one. And then it's quickly revealed throughout, when we see him like fucking with the hockey stick and stuff like that, that he's sort of he's at this point where like we were talking about, he should be moving on, but he might be delving into even more of a childish phase than what he started at when he was initially at the age where this might have been seen as acceptable, certainly more acceptable than at the age he's at now, with the responsibilities he should have now. And I feel like there is something there in the fact that we do see a real descent of Frank as the movie goes on, that seems to peak at the right around the birthday party, when Mitch and Beanie are kind of talking, and then in the background you can just see Frank like just checking the presents and just throwing them, and then ultimately the tranquilizer kind of being his. You would think the streaking would have been rock bottom for Frank, but it's interesting that the streaking is just the start of his descent. So that kind of setup can be very funny as far as a character goes. And it's really funny that you can put this much stock into Frank and talk about Frank's character this much, because he's not even the main focus. And I think that might be an issue when you think about the fact that Mitch is kind of the central player here, and it's a common thing, obviously, especially in movies like this, for the straight man to be a bit more, not necessarily just being the straight man so that people can play off of him, but just being kind of bland in general. But I feel like there's something deliberate about the casting of Luke Wilson for a part like this that helps that make sense. But I don't know that I wouldn't want him to be too over the top since he is the straight man, but I still feel like that Luke Wilson's performance isn't reactionary enough to be something they can bounce off of. And it's especially when you've got such two different types coming at him between what Farrell's doing and what Vaughn's doing, which is essentially the Farrell thing and the Vaughn thing. um, and it's like you can really chalk this movie up a lot to probably how it took them a while, and not only a while, but they're still trying to break out of these comedic types that they've set up for themselves, that they kind of trap themselves in. Um, but yeah, that's about as far as Vaughn goes. Um, I do think that I remember him being the standout character to me. Like when I first saw it, since I wasn't really into the Farrell thing, because it was much more of that sort of. I'm trying to figure out how you describe. I even did a video on swingers, but I'm still trying to figure out how you describe what exactly the Vaughn thing is, where he's got that sort of. I don't know if you'd call it a sarcastic tone, but he can say the most outrageous things or suggest the most outrageous things, but have this tone of voice that sounds extremely logical. Which is how they end up in the situations that they end up in, how Mitchapalooza happens, how the whole frat thing happens, is all because Beanie is just so smooth talking. So it's actually a pretty ingenious setup that's what his character does for a living, is sells things. So, and not only that, but extremely successfully. Like, successfully enough that they can afford to do the shit that they do. Which essentially feels like a prolonged Fight Club joke after a while. Not just for the whole, literally, there's an underground, I don't know what you call that, a fighting scene, but a wrestling scene, I guess you could say. But the whole idea of, like, when they go to Mitch's place of work and they talk to him feels very much like some parody of Fight Club or something that doesn't quite have much of a payoff or much of a punchline, but I feel like that's kind of a lot of this movie. Is a lot of it is a lot of setups, and the setups are kind of the jokes so much that when the payoffs actually get here, a lot of them can be pretty underwhelming. I was gonna start off by saying this, but I guess I've made it. I'm getting ready to make it clear now. Um, I'm not in love with old school, and I've never really been that in love with old school. And when I was hearing people back in the day when it first came out claiming it's like amazing and like one of the best comedies ever, um, it was uh, it was kind of lost on me. And as it was one of those cases where it's like I get all the jokes even as a kid, but it's like maybe I'll grow into it. It's one of those movies, but no, it's it's very. I think one thing is that it is absolutely paper thin. Like the whole movie is so thin, to the point that when you look at some of the side characters, where you would think we'd have something there and there'd be standout characters there, but really the characters on the side just exist as jokes. Like, Weensy's fat, and that's his character. Simon Helberg is a nerd, and that's his character. Blue is old, and that's it. And every time we see these characters, it's just kind of those jokes over and over again in different settings. And yeah, by the time we get to really big payoffs for those, like Wainsey having to do the vault or Blue dying, those jokes have just so worn themselves out by this point that when they finally get to their ultimate payoffs, their ultimate punchlines, it's just sort of, it almost feels anticlimactic, much like the movie itself. I always forget just how quickly this movie ends. Because we have the whole Billy Madison climax, where it's like doing all the different events. Um, but it just feels so like everything got here so quickly, and the whole concept is just so stretching itself out as much as it can, when there's really not much there at all, and just the way the concept in general just kind of comes up. Like with PCU, we can start bouncing around now. With PCU, we actually get a great setup of the whole thing that's going on through a great visual gag at the very start. Where the whole idea is that, you know, the frats and stuff like that have been outlawed, and now it's all just down to just these little groups of people just doing their own thing. And the way they set this up, when the new kid comes in and sees, you know, the old pictures from like the 60s, and everybody's in like the jackets and all that, and just really well dressed and well kept, and everything looks so official, and then as it goes on, then it's like the pictures are getting smaller, and then like they're hippies now, and then the final punchline, there's just a Polaroid that falls off the wall eventually. And like that visual gag by itself basically sets up the whole thing that's going on here and the whole concept and where we're headed in a really funny way. And when we get to some of these side characters, we run into the old school problem where it's a lot of the characters are types, like, or just like the characters are their jokes. But the thing is where, Weensy's fat, Blue is old, stuff like that. Simon Helberg's nerdy. We get stuff that's really out of nowhere hilarious, like the one guy that is glued to the TV through the whole movie, because his thesis is about the theory of flipping through channels, and the theory is that you'll always find a Michael Caine movie or a Gene Hackman movie. And while I was talking about the final payoffs are just whatever in old school, like to the point that they feel anticlimactic because it's just the same joke, that joke has such a great payoff. I actually have a bridge too far right here. And every time that punchline comes, I feel like it's one of the most well-earned punchlines. And I love that. And there's also characters like Jake Busey, where it's just like, oh, he's high. He's forgetful because he's high. But then we have characters like Jon Favreau, and maybe it's funny mainly because Jon Favreau is like this really big, accomplished, sought-out director now. And obviously he's been successfully writing since Swingers. And to see him play a character like this, with that in mind, to think that this is the guy that's doing all the insane things with technology the Disney remakes are doing, and this is the guy that started the MCU. This guy. And this character has always been so funny to me. And I think he wasn't the massive big-time director that he was the first time I saw this movie. So the character was always very, very funny to me. He's just gotten progressively funnier because of how successful Favreau is now and how big of a name he is now in the industry. But the thing about it is basically just one joke that Gutter's sent to go get the beer, and he fails. He has one task, and he fails it. Because he stops and, gets high with Jake Busey and then passes out on the sidewalk. And once again, though, it's the payoffs where... But not only that. The payoff is funny when he wakes up and it's night and everything's closed. But what's even funnier about that is how important this task is to Gutter. How this is like the most important thing in his entire life up to this point. This is the biggest thing that's ever happened to him, is this task of just getting the beer. To the fact that he has that whole nightmare sequence where he's in front of the Senate. That is really, really funny. That is the way where it's like you take a one joke that a character has, and that's all the character is, and you do like the biggest thing you can with it and the funniest thing you can with it. Even if it's that simple. And it's like the commitment is what is so funny about that. And that's something I feel like the characters in old school could have used a lot more of. And I get if you want to have the argument that there's not really enough time to get into a lot of characters, because in settings like this there's going to be a lot of side characters, and their main point is just to be funny when they're on screen, and then until they come back. But it helps a lot when the jokes are that funny and don't wear themselves out and aren't just one note the whole time. And as far as how they handle, there is something going on in PCU that we don't really see a lot of in old school, unless I'm like really, really desensitized to it. But the whole idea that how the title's kind of a play on words as well, because there's a lot of jokes about being politically correct and stuff like that, which is it's in that case obviously it's quite timeless, because there are anti-PC jokes in this movie that you can still hear anybody say today if you just walk outside. But what I like about PCU, and maybe I'm seeing it the wrong way, I don't know, maybe I'm giving the movie too much credit, I don't know, but the thing I don't mind about how... Because it can seem a bit desperate if you latch onto anti-PC jokes, and how it becomes more of like spiteful bitching than jokes and humor, and how easy it is to turn into that. But it's like, while we do get scenes that feel cruel, like the scene when they're throwing the meat down at the vegan protest, I never feel like there's anything malicious in this. Like, it doesn't feel like the jokes are being told out of spite, which is the problem with so many anti-PC jokes. The fact that they're going strictly for humor, I think, is what makes it work and doesn't make those jokes feel like they're just desperate. Um, and I think that's kind of a really important line you got to like really lay down. Like I said, I could be wrong, but with the way the characters, eventually work out, and the fact that we've got, obviously our villain is David Spade, and there's a lot of Republican jokes that go with him. So there's like, it feels like everybody's kind of fair game, um, and but at the same time, let's talk about that too. Of the fact that David Spade is built up to be our villain, and ironically enough, Jeremy Piven in Old School plays a very similar character. Obviously, Piven has much more control over what's going on. For that, we have Jessica Walter, the unfortunately late Jessica Walter in PCU. But to put the focus on Pritchard and whatever Spade's name was in PCU, that's one thing about PCU is that I don't remember hardly any of the characters' names. But that's hardly the point in movies like this. But as long as they're funny. But the thing about this is, I do think PCU is a bit more, I don't, responsible seems like a strong word, but the way they handle their villains, and how both these villains, you could say, were made by the heroes. Because obviously when we very first meet Piven in Old School, the first thing they say is like, he used to be the dork around them and they locked him in a dumpster. And they would bully him. And now this is basically the whole plot of the movie is him getting revenge. So Pritchard might as well be the hero in his own story. And we learn a similar story in PCU about how Spade used to be Piven's roommate, and Piven made his life a living hell. And like, we actually get this moment, like almost like of clarity, but you almost also kind of get the vibe that Piven's character always knew this. When there is a very much a self-awareness in Piven's character in PCU when he has this moment when Spade comes in and he's, being a douchebag, and he's talking about antagonizing the way that he does in that very 90s David Spade way. And he has a flashback where he's talking to people. I think it's Alex Desire he's talking to. And he says, oh man, it must have been hell being that guy's roommate, talking about Spade. And then Piven has a flashback, and it was Piven making him miserable. And Piven seems completely aware of this, that that's what it was. And so, like, in Piven's mind, it's like, I know why this guy's coming after me. And, like, there's something there that's lacking in Old School, where it's like, it's never once established. Like, it's not even remotely hinted at that Pritchard might be the hero in his own story, and all of this is really just revenge for bullying. To the point, and it is so, and you could say this is, part of the dark humor of it, and yeah, I'm a fan of dark humor, so yes, this is very, very funny. And the fact that, Pritchard fucking dies. And so does Craig Kilborn, Mark. And we talked about this before. Me and my brother actually talked about Road Trip sometime last year, and we talked about Todd Phillips' affinity for killing his villains in his comedies because of Anthony Rapp's fate in Road Trip. And it's almost like this funny running joke between these movies that Todd Phillips is making these, just silly comedies in which the villains that do nothing particularly evil, they just antagonize the heroes in the way you would in a college-set movie. And they die. and Pritchard and Mark especially go out horribly. See, that's that's really, really funny, but the rest of the movie's humor isn't really that dark. You could say Blue's death is kind of dark, but it's not driving a car off a bridge into another person and exploding dark. And and the fact that it happens in the middle of the credits. And it's like, I'm curious what it would have been like if the movie was, like, had that twisted of a sense of humor the whole time. Like it doesn't feel like it has a twisted sense of humor. It's like it's just kind of being raunchy in the very basic way, in a very predictable way that we've seen many times before. But it's yeah, because talking about really with PCU, I more get this vibe than Old School. How these movies kind of capture the vibe that the straight to video National Lampoon movies kind of ruined. Where it's like it's because obviously if you want to take the National Lampoon label, that takes us back to Animal House, which basically started this whole thing. And when we were talking about Porky's, I talked about how I don't really have much of a favorable opinion of Animal House either. I kind of feel like it's also quite outdated and played out, and I was never into Belushi, so that's a whole thing in itself. And you might say maybe I just don't care for the genre, given that I don't think Old School is all that either. Um, and so maybe like our senses of humor just aren't lining up or something. But there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of humor that I find in PCU. I find PCU very funny. And I think another thing that helps PCU in a way where Old School might kind of falter is it's a very complicated line here where I was talking about, you're not necessarily going to go into a movie like this looking for character depth, but if it's in there successfully, it can help. Like it's not going to hurt, for sure. So when you try to inject that, there's upsides and downsides to both of these, and both these movies show it off. PCU doesn't have anything like that I can think of, apart from that one moment where Piven seems to have a moment of clarity that Spade is the way he is because he tortured him, basically, when they were roommates. But that's it. But that's something else that I can say is good about PCU that I've complained about a lot with comedies is that it always stays a comedy. Like even when it's in its conflict stage, there's usually always something funny going on. It doesn't try to push itself into being something else for temporarily while it tries to work out its story. And how a lot of comedies try too hard to be dramas, especially in this Apatow age. But Old School does reach that point. Where we do finally, once Blue dies, we start to settle down. After the big punchline that Blue dies, we have this scene that actually does attempt to be serious when Frank and his wife are coming to the conclusion that they might need to get a divorce, and like this is coming down. And they play it totally straight. And I just don't, I never cared about that. Like, it's, like, I get that we see his arc, but I was never invested in it enough that when it actually tries to get serious, it just doesn't, and it doesn't really add any depth to the character either. Like I was talking about, like, if you get more invested in a character in a comedy, even if it's through something dramatic, it might make the situations they get into funnier. That's not what happens with Frank, especially since he pretty much just comes full circle when he runs into Juliette Lewis at the end anyway, and with the very last scene with Artie Lang and the other guy where he's like screaming and doing his whole thing. There's not really... It just really feel like there's anything there. And then we get the stuff with Nicole and Luke Wilson and their whole thing, and there's really... I just have no investment in that whatsoever. Like, there's nothing there. The only comedic angle to it is when he's... And there's this running joke with Alicia Cuthbert where she's this potentially underage girl that he's had a one-night stand with, and then there's his boss who is for some reason played by an uncredited Terry O'Quinn. Okay. And then the whole thing when that's established that Alicia Cuthbert's his daughter when he didn't know that, and then how that comes back for a bit of conflict when he's saying like, oh, he's never done anything reckless and stuff like that, and then she comes in, and that's quite funny when she comes in at just the wrong time. But even so, the fact that it sets up the same tired conflict, and that's not even to bring in the tired conflicts that Mark is bringing into this. It's all so fucking played out, and a conflict that's just not really... Like, I don't know who in the target audience is going to watch Old School and give one single shit about that conflict. The only thing that I think really rings true, interestingly enough, is done in one brief scene, and that's when Beanie rejects the girl because of his wife. And it's like, that's something they've been setting up enough to where that scene is really interesting. When he's the one telling Frank, don't get married, and oh, marriage is torture and all that, and it's just all marriage is bad, and oh, my life is just, he's Chris Elliott, and there's something about marriage. Each day is better than the next. Um, and then that's like a whole other. We suddenly see like a whole other layer to Beanie of all people. Like the one character we just kind of assumed we had figured out because he was so straightforward about everything that he did and said. And then it turns out there's more to him. And I think that's the thing, was revealing something about him we weren't able to figure out way in advance is what makes that scene really interesting about Beanie's character. Everything else is so choreographed from the first moment we meet people. Like I said, it's a nice misdirection with Frank at the beginning, but we still know we're getting a Will Ferrell character because we know Will Ferrell's thing. So, it does have that, but like I said, and that kind of movie that we get with Beanie is not something that's going to be present in PCU. So Old School does have that going for it. And I do think, as far as I guess we can, as far as the way Spade is handled, where he's not crushed to death and then blown up like Mark or Pritchard. But the idea of coming from this PC angle of everybody's basically making fun of everybody, and everybody's the target of these pranks, these ultimately harmless pranks, I think is something that helps make it work as well. But the fact that while, they play cruel pranks and stuff like that, there is enough coming together that the only person that gets a real comeuppance is the only person that was coming from a real place of hate, which was Spade. The scene where we get him on the stage and he's outed talking about everything, like where everybody was just coming from this playful place of, oh, I don't agree with these people, let's play pranks on them. And Spade is just full of hate. And while we do get a glimpse of where that might come from, there's a lot of this would not have come from just being Jeremy Piven's roommate. This is deep-seated hate, so it feels earned when he's being chased by a mob at the end, and that's pretty much like right where the movie ends. Here we get a lot of stuff that's just not really earned. Like, I don't give a shit about Frank and his wife. I don't give a shit about Mitch and Nicole. I don't give a shit about Mitch standing up to his boss. Like, that doesn't, like, all of the scene, anything involving Mitch at work as a storyline is just there. So, and I guess you could say Mitch has some sort of arc where he's kind of been walked all over, but even then, something seems to break in him pretty immediately after he outs Juliette Lewis for what she's been doing. So even that doesn't feel like there's a massive arc or anything. So it's like he's been embracing his recklessness for most of the movie. So, like, that's kind of what the movie is Mitch embracing his recklessness. So him yelling at his boss at the end isn't some big payoff. So it's just another thing of him doing it, what he's been doing the whole movie, and now we're at the end. And yeah, so, and then like I was saying, Old School just feels so, and I think the reason Old School feels so thin, despite the fact, and somehow PCU doesn't, despite the fact that PCU is so incredibly short. They're both short, but PCU barely breaks an hour 20, and that's including credits. But there's just so much going on. There's so much humor in the jokes and the way the characters pay off and how they all kind of come around to each other. And just Old School feels like it's the same movie from beginning to end with nothing really. And like, because by the time we get to them, doing all the different events and stuff like that, it feels like we just get there so abruptly, and then the end is so abrupt. Like the final one, where Waynsey does the vault, is the end of that. And then it's like, that's so anticlimactic, we have to have the scene where they chase Piven around the building. And then even that ends really abruptly, and then right after that ends abruptly, the movie ends abruptly. And it's just so... I've just felt like Old School, despite its popularity, is a movie that barely exists. Like that's just how it just feels so slight to me and so minor. It's still weird to me how much of a big deal it is in a lot of circles as far as comedies go, or at least top comedies of this era. So I don't know, and it certainly feels much smaller than other Todd Phillips comedies because I think Road Trip is significantly higher than this on the comedy totem pole. And then of course, obviously, he would go on to The Hangover, which will become iconic. But so yeah, when you look at Road Trip being his start, and then him creating this iconic movie with The Hangover, this in between feels so small to me, and I don't know. And it's not. And like I said, I would expect somebody to say that wasn't around when it came out and just discovered it later. But no, I'm somebody that was right there when it came out. I remember everybody's reaction. I remember it being in theaters. Like I said, even though I didn't see it in theaters, I saw it when it was brand new. Like it was probably at least a few days, at most a few days after it came out on DVD is when I saw it. And I just never really got anything more than just this minor quality. But I don't know, and PCU is a movie that I've actually come back to more often, not just because it's shorter, but just because I feel like I laugh harder at PCU. I don't like. There's big laughs in PCU, and maybe it's because I'm not into Will Ferrell's thing that much. Will Ferrell doing his over the top shouty thing, the nudity is, I guess, supposed to be funny as well. And I don't. You know what? You know what moment gets me in Old School that makes me really laugh is the moment when Mitch confronts Matt Walsh at work, and Matt Walsh is about to out him because he knows he slept with Alicia Cuthbert, and Mitch's response immediately is to slap him. For some reason, that moment makes me laugh really hard. I think it's because Luke Wilson has this great moment when he's just like talking to him, and he goes completely serious stone face in that split second where he slaps him, and then he immediately catches himself and apologizes. that it's so fleeting. It lasts for like a fraction of a second, and that might be the funniest moment in the movie to me. Maybe it's not the tranquilizer scene isn't funny to me so much in regards to what happens to Frank and how he reacts to it and the whole falling into the pool thing. The funniest thing by far about the tranquilizer scene is Seann William Scott's reaction to it. Like the fact that he's so jazzed about this. All he can do is scream yes over and over again. That's really funny. But the whole dragging it out and, Frank going into slow-mo and careening into everything is it's just a dead end joke to me. I don't know. So like I was talking about, if this is how I feel about like Animal House, maybe just this whole theme isn't for me. But I quite like PC, so I really don't know. But that's pretty much where I land with this. I think one scene I didn't mention in Old School was the Andy Dick scene, where they did bring in stuff like he has like the dog that he has a matching shirt with, which is kind of funny, and he brought in the vernacular of Mind the Stepchildren, which is now immortal, so it's got that going for it. So what kind of place are you in where the person in your movie with the memorable jokes is Andy Dick? Like that's I don't know. Yeah, if people like haven't seen PCU, I kind of hope they do, and I hope they dig it when they do. I could see maybe it being like how I feel about Old School, maybe too slight, and maybe the jokes aren't. But I don't know, with that whole, PC versus anti-PC thing, I feel like it's still pretty relevant. It's quite relevant, I feel like. Because I guess you've got people bitching about that constantly still. So, but like I said, the fact that PCU makes those jokes without spite is extremely important to how I think it works as a comedy. So, yeah, so I think that's how I feel about these. So, next we're probably going to go into something completely different. Like you have no idea how different. And there's also the new releases, Dear Evan Hansen and The Eyes of Tammy Faye, and we've got the Oscar video coming and some other stuff. And then of course October stuff, which we know what that is, and more Tremors stuff as well. So until all of that stuff, I think that's it.